What if I told you that right now, as you're watching this, someone just read 3 things about you that you didn't even realize you were showing? The way you're sitting reveals whether you're relaxed or anxious. The direction of your gaze shows what you're truly interested in. Even the micro pause before you clicked on this video told an observer something about your decision-making process. Intelligence operatives see the world this way constantly, and once you understand how they do it, you'll never look at everyday interactions the same way again. The gap between a trained spy and an average person isn't access to gadgets or classified information. It has a fundamental difference in how they process the world around them. And those skills are far more accessible than you'd think. Every intelligence agency in the world, whether it's the CIA, MI6, Mossad, or any other organization operating in the shadows, builds their training on a foundation that has nothing to do with weapons or technology. It's built on observation, memory, communication, and awareness. These aren't superhuman abilities. They're learnable skills that have been refined over decades of field operations, psychological research, and sometimes painful trial and error. The reason these agencies invest so heavily in training these mental capabilities is simple. In their world, missing a detail can mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure, between staying safe and walking into a trap. But here's what's interesting: those same high stakes exist in your life too, just in different forms. Missing social cues can cost you a job opportunity. Failing to notice when someone's being dishonest can damage relationships or financial decisions. Walking through life unaware of your surroundings can compromise your safety. The techniques operatives use aren't just for espionage. They're for navigating a complex world with your eyes open. Let me take you inside how this actually works. When an intelligence officer is deployed to a foreign city, one of their first priorities is something called environmental mapping. They're not just learning street names, they're absorbing the rhythm of the place. What time do crowds form at the cafe on the corner? Which shopkeeper makes eye contact with customers and which ones don't? Where are the blind spots in security camera coverage? What's the ambient noise level at different times of day? This isn't paranoia. It's creating a mental baseline of normal so that anything abnormal immediately stands out. You can use this exact same approach in your daily environment. When you walk into your office building, the coffee shop you visit regularly, or even your own neighborhood, most people move through on autopilot. An operative would spend their first few visits creating a detailed mental map, not just of the physical space, but of the patterns. They'd notice that the barista always serves the person on the left first, that the security guard changes shifts at exactly 3:15. That on Thursdays the parking lot fills up 30 minutes earlier. Once you have this baseline, deviations become obvious. The day something's wrong, you'll feel it before you can articulate why, because your subconscious has already registered that the pattern broke. This connects directly to one of the most powerful skills in the intelligence playbook: reading baseline behavior in people. Forget everything you've seen about lie detection and movies polygraphs. And interrogation rooms are how professionals actually extract truth in most situations. The real technique is far more subtle and far more effective. When an operative needs to determine if someone is being truthful, they don't start with the hard questions. They begin with conversations about neutral topics, while carefully observing the person's natural communication style. Does this person maintain steady eye contact naturally? Or do they tend to glance away when thinking? Do they gesture with their hands when relaxed, or keep them still? What's their normal speech pace and breathing rhythm? Every person has a unique set of behaviors that constitute their normal, relaxed state. Once you've established what normal looks like for that individual, you can ask the important questions and watch for deviations. If someone who normally maintains eye contact suddenly can't meet your gaze when discussing a specific topic, that's not necessarily proof of deception, but it's a signal that warrants attention. If their speech pattern shifts from fluid to halting exactly when you mention finances or a certain person's name, you've learned something valuable. This isn't about becoming suspicious of everyone around you. It's about developing the ability to notice incongruence between what people say and what their unconscious behavior reveals. The complementary skill to reading others is controlling what you reveal. And this is where tradecraft becomes immediately practical for daily life. Intelligence officers are trained in something called impression management, which sounds manipulative but is really just the deliberate version of something everyone does unconsciously. You already change your behavior based on context. You don't act the same way in a job interview as you do with close friends. Operatives simply take this further by understanding exactly what signals they're sending and adjusting them with precision. In practical terms, this means being aware that your body language, vocal tone, clothing choices, and even the timing of your responses all communicate information. If you're negotiating a salary and you lean forward eagerly when they mention a number, you've just told them that number exceeded your expectations and you've lost leverage. If you're in a difficult conversation and you cross your arms and break eye contact, you've signaled defensiveness before you've even spoken. By becoming conscious of these signals, you gain the ability to choose what you project. This isn't about being fake, it's about having control over your own presentation, rather than letting unconscious habits speak for you. Perhaps the most immediately applicable skill from intelligence training is situational awareness, which is radically different from the paranoid hypervigilance people sometimes imagine. Real situational awareness is calm, sustainable, and based on pattern recognition rather than constant vigilance. Operatives are taught to conduct what is called a baseline scan whenever they enter a new environment, identifying exits, noting who's present, observing sight lines and potential cover. Then, instead of staying in high alert mode, they simply conduct periodic update scans, checking if anything has changed from the baseline. This approach is sustainable because it doesn't require constant tension. You can practice this every time you enter a restaurant, office, or public space. Take 10 seconds when you arrive to note the layout, who's there, where the exits are. That's it. Then go about your business normally. But every few minutes, do a quick mental check. Has anyone new arrived? Has the configuration changed? Is there anything different? This simple practice dramatically increases your safety and awareness without turning you into a nervous wreck. It has the same mental habit that lets experienced drivers navigate traffic safely. While holding a conversation, they are not consciously analyzing every car around them constantly, but they've built a mental model of the traffic pattern, and their brain automatically flags deviations. What makes these techniques powerful isn't their complexity, it's their compounding effect. An operative who can read a room, establish behavioral baselines, control their own signals, and maintain environmental awareness isn't doing four separate things. They're running one integrated system of perception and response. That becomes intuitive with practice. That same integration is available to you, and once these skills begin to connect, you'll find yourself navigating social situations with more confidence, making better judgments about who to trust, and moving through your environment with a quiet assurance that most people never develop. The world hasn't changed, but your relationship to it has. And that shift in perspective is exactly what separates someone who simply experiences life from someone who actively shapes their path through it. The moment you shift from simply observing environments to truly understanding people, you cross a threshold that separates casual awareness from genuine insight. Intelligence operatives spend years developing what psychologists call theory of mind, the ability to construct accurate mental models of what others are thinking, feeling, and planning based on limited observable information. This isn't mind reading, and it's certainly not manipulation. It is the disciplined practice of paying attention to the signals people constantly broadcast, but rarely recognize they are sending. When a case officer sits across from a potential asset in a quiet cafe somewhere in Eastern Europe, their survival and success depend not on what's said in the conversation, but on accurately reading everything that isn't said. The slight hesitation before answering a question, the micro expression that flashes across someone's face before they compose themselves. These are exotic skills requiring years of training in a classified facility. They are enhanced versions of social perception that anyone can develop through deliberate practice and conscious attention. The foundation of reading people accurately is understanding that human communication operates on multiple channels simultaneously, and the verbal channel is often the least reliable. When someone tells you they're fine while their jaw is clenched, their shoulders are raised, and their breathing is shallow, their body is telling you the truth that their words are concealing. Intelligence professionals are trained to give far more weight to nonverbal communication because it's governed by older, less conscious parts of the brain that are much harder to control. You can rehearse what you're going to say and carefully choose your words, but controlling your pupil dilation, the muscle movements around your eyes, or the autonomic stress response that slightly changes your skin tone is vastly more difficult. This is why experienced operatives focus intensely on establishing baseline behavior. First, they need to know what relaxed and truthful looks like for the specific person before they can identify stress or deception. In your daily life, this translates to a simple practice. When you are having any conversation that matters, whether it is a performance review, a difficult discussion with a partner, or a negotiation of any kind, spend the first portion of the interaction on comfortable topics. While you observe how this person naturally communicates, notice their default eye contact pattern, their natural speaking rhythm, whether they're a gesture or prefer stillness, how they hold tension in their body. Only then do you have the comparative framework to notice when something shifts. One of the most counterintuitive lessons from intelligence work is that silence is not empty space. To be filled it as a powerful tool for both gathering information and maintaining control. In Western culture especially, there's tremendous social pressure to fill conversational pauses, and most people become uncomfortable with silence after just 3 or 4 seconds. Operatives are trained to become comfortable with much longer silences because they've learned that people reveal more when trying to fill uncomfortable quiet than they do when answering direct questions. When you ask someone a question and they give you an answer, a normal conversation pattern is to immediately respond or ask a follow-up question. But if you simply maintain attentive eye contact and wait in silence for another moment, something fascinating happens. The other person almost always continues talking, and what comes out in those next few seconds is often more honest and revealing than their prepared response. They're no longer answering your question. They're filling silence, and the internal editor that screens their words becomes less vigilant. You can use this technique ethically in any situation where you need to understand someone's true position. In a negotiation, ask your question and then become comfortable with silence. In a difficult personal conversation, share your perspective and then simply wait rather than justifying or explaining further. The silence creates space for truth the constant talking obscures. Building genuine trust is perhaps the most sophisticated skill in the intelligence toolkit, and it has nothing to do with deception. When a case officer needs to develop a relationship with someone who has access to valuable information, they are not trying to trick the person, they are trying to create an authentic connection that makes the person want to share information. The techniques they use are based on deep psychological research into how humans form bonds and assess trustworthiness. At the core is something called limbic synchrony, the unconscious mirroring of energy, pace, and emotional state between the people who are genuinely connecting. You've experienced this naturally when you've had a great conversation with someone and suddenly realized you've both leaned in. You're speaking at similar volumes and speeds, and there's an effortless rhythm to the exchange. Intelligence officers learn to create this deliberately by carefully matching the other person's communication style. If someone speaks slowly and thoughtfully, rushing your responses creates disconnect. If someone is energized and speaks quickly, being overly measured makes you seem distant. This isn't about changing who you are, it is about meeting people in their communication comfort zone rather than forcing them into yours. When you consciously practice this kind of calibration, people consistently report feeling more understood and comfortable in your presence, not because you've manipulated them, but because you've reduced the friction that normally exists when different communication styles collide. The emotional control that operatives maintain in high-stress situations might seem cold or calculating from the outside, but it's actually a form of compassion both for themselves and others. When you're in a tense conversation and someone becomes angry or defensive, your natural biological response is to match that energy. Your heart rate increases, stress hormones flood your system, and your own defensiveness rises. In that state, you make worse decisions, say things you regret, and escalate rather than resolve conflicts. Intelligence professionals are trained in emotional regulation not to be robotic, but to remain effective when stakes are high. The technique is simpler than it sounds. You consciously recognize the emotional state rising in your body. You name it internally without judgment, and you deliberately slow your breathing while maintaining a relaxed posture. This physiological intervention actually changes your neurological state-controlled breathing, activates your parasympathetic nervous system, and dampens the fight-or-flight response. The practical application is remarkable. When someone raises their voice at you in a meeting, instead of matching their energy, you can maintain a calm, steady tone and open body language. About 70% of the time, they'll unconsciously begin to match your calmer state within 30 to 60 seconds. You've changed the emotional temperature of the room, not through confrontation or appeasement, but through regulated self-control that becomes contagious. Understanding when to engage deeply in a conversation and when to remain in observation mode is a skill that separates strategic communicators from reactive ones. Every conversation presents you with choices about how much of yourself to reveal, how much energy to invest, and whether this is a moment for connection or simply information gathering. Operatives constantly make these assessments because in their world, every interaction is potentially consequential. A casual conversation at a conference might be just that, or it might be an opportunity to develop a valuable contact, or it might be someone else conducting reconnaissance on them. They decide consciously rather than defaulting to their personality's automatic settings. If you're naturally extroverted and share openly, there's nothing wrong with that, but you're more effective if that's a choice rather than a compulsion. Some situations call for authentic vulnerability that builds real connection. Other situations call for polite but reserved engagement that doesn't give away your position before you understand the landscape. The skill is recognizing which is which. When you're in a new professional environment, meeting people who might become colleagues or competitors, beginning in observation mode while you assess dynamics gives you information others don't have because they started talking immediately. When you're building a relationship with someone who matters to you, choosing moments for deeper engagement creates impact that constant superficial interaction never achieves. Neither mode is superior. What matters is conscious choice based on situational awareness, rather than habitual reaction. The progression you've been moving through from observing environments to reading people, to controlling your own responses, and choosing your engagement level builds towards something deeper than technique. These are all external applications of internal capabilities and the most profound skills that separate exceptional intelligence operatives from average ones. Have nothing to do with what they do in the world and everything to do with how they've trained their minds to function. The real advantage isn't in reading body language or managing conversations. It is in the cognitive infrastructure that makes those things possible. Memory systems that capture and retain details most people never notice. Focus that can maintain attention on relevant information while filtering distraction. Perception that processes multiple streams of information simultaneously without becoming overwhelmed. These internal capabilities are what transform technique into intuition, and they're entirely learnable if you understand how they actually work. The difference between an ordinary person walking through a crowded airport and a trained intelligence operative moving through that same space isn't about what they see. It is about what they notice. Both sets of eyes receive the same visual information, the same thousands of data points flooding their optical nerves every second. But one brain discards almost all of it as noise, while the other has been trained to recognize which fragments matter and how they connect into meaningful patterns. This distinction between seeing and noticing is perhaps the most fundamental cognitive shift in intelligence training, and it has nothing to do with having a photographic memory or exceptional IQ. It is about teaching your brain what to pay attention to and building the mental architecture to process that information without conscious effort. When you understand how this works, you realize that most people move through life in a kind of functional blindness, not because their vision is poor, but because their attention has never been properly directed. Intelligence operatives are taught to think in patterns rather than isolated details, because the human brain isn't actually very good at remembering random information, but is extraordinary at recognizing relationships and deviations from expected norms. If you try to memorize that a man in a coffee shop is wearing a blue jacket, has brown hair, and is sitting near the window, you'll likely forget these details within minutes, because they're disconnected facts with no inherent meaning. But if you notice that every morning this week the same man has been in the coffee shop, before you arrive, always sitting in a position with a clear view of the entrance, and he's one of only 3 people who never looks at their phone while waiting, you've identified a pattern that your brain will retain because it suggests intention and breaks from normal behavior. This is how operatives build situational awareness that actually persists. They're not cataloging everything they see. They're identifying what doesn't fit the baseline of ordinary behavior in that environment. You can apply the same approach to any recurring environment in your life. Instead of trying to notice everything at your weekly team meeting, observe the patterns. Who consistently arrives early and who rushes in late? Who speaks first and who waits to see which way the conversation goes? When does your manager's body language shift from open to closed? These patterns tell you far more than any individual detail could, and your brain will retain them naturally because they have predictive value for future interactions. The most valuable cognitive skill in intelligence work isn't memory or observation, it's attention control. The ability to direct your focus deliberately and sustain it despite distraction. In an era where the average person's attention span has been systematically eroded by designed addiction to notifications, an algorithmic feeds the simple ability to maintain genuine focus on a single thread for an extended period has become a rare competitive advantage. When an operative is in a meeting where critical information might emerge, they're not fighting the urge to check their phone or letting their mind wander to unrelated concerns. They've trained themselves to maintain what psychologists call executive attention, the capacity to keep your conscious focus aligned with your intentional goal, rather than being pulled by whatever stimulus happens to be most immediate or emotionally salient. This isn't about superhuman concentration, it is about recognizing when your attention has drifted and gently redirecting it, dozens of times if necessary, without self-judgment or frustration. You experience this every time you are in a conversation with someone and realize you've been nodding along while thinking about something else entirely. The difference is that trained attention control means you catch the drift within seconds, rather than minutes, and you bring yourself back before you miss something important. In practical terms, this means that in an hour-long meeting, you actually retain the key information while others leave with only fragments. Not because you're smarter, but because you were genuinely present for more of that hour. Memory, as it turns out, isn't really about storage capacity, it's about how effectively you encode information in the first place, and that encoding depends almost entirely on context and meaning. Intelligence training includes extensive work on memory techniques, but the foundation isn't mnemonics or tricks. It's understanding that your brain remembers things in networks of association, rather than as isolated facts. When you meet someone at a networking event and they tell you their name is Sarah, if you simply repeat Sarah to yourself a few times, you'll likely forget it before the conversation ends. But if you notice that she is wearing a distinctive silver bracelet, and she mentioned she just returned from hiking in Colorado, and you create a brief mental narrative connecting these elements, Sarah with a silver bracelet, who loves Colorado mountains, you've given your brain multiple retrieval pathways to that name. The emotional component matters too. If Sarah shares something that genuinely interests you or surprises you, the mild emotional response actually strengthens the memory formation. because your brain tags emotionally significant information as worth retaining. This is why operatives are trained to engage authentically with people, rather than mechanically going through conversational motions. The genuine curiosity and emotional presence isn't just about building rapport. It is about creating the conditions for natural memory encoding. When you're truly present in a conversation, truly interested in what someone is sharing, you remember it without effort because your brain is doing what it evolved to do, retaining information that has emotional and social relevance. The gap between seeing and noticing becomes starkly clear when you consider how most people navigate familiar environments. You probably drive or walk the same route regularly. But if someone asked you how many traffic lights are on that route, what businesses occupy specific corners, or what color the building is at a particular intersection, you struggle to answer despite having seen these things hundreds of times. You've been looking without noticing, processing just enough visual information to navigate safely while your conscious attention is elsewhere. An operative trained in observational awareness would be able to describe the route in considerable detail, not because they have better vision, but because they've developed the habit of conscious noticing. They're actively engaged with their environment rather than moving through it on autopilot. This doesn't mean obsessively cataloging every detail. It means periodic moments of full presence, where you actually look at what is in front of you with genuine attention. When you walk into your office building tomorrow, instead of moving through the lobby while thinking about your email inbox, try spending just 10 seconds of genuine attention on what's actually there. Not anxious scanning or suspicious surveillance, just present observation. Notice the quality of light, the people present, the sounds and textures of the space. This brief moment of full presence gives your brain actual data to work with, rather than the blurred background your autopilot mode typically records. Do this consistently, and you'll find that your recall of environments, conversations, and experiences improves dramatically, not because you're trying harder to remember, but because you were actually present when the experience occurred. The advantage of staying present extends far beyond memory and observation. It fundamentally changes how you respond to situations as they unfold. When your attention is fragmented across multiple concerns, worries about the future, and replays of the past, you're essentially navigating the present moment with only a fraction of your cognitive capacity. An intelligence officer in a fluid situation can't afford that fragmentation. They need their full capability available to assess and respond to whatever emerges, which means they've trained themselves to maintain what meditation traditions call presence and what psychologists call mindfulness. This isn't mystical, it's intensely practical. When you're fully present in a negotiation, you catch the micro-hesitation before someone agrees to terms, the slight shift in tone that suggests flexibility, the moment when they're actually ready to close rather than still positioning. When you're present in a difficult conversation with someone you care about, you hear what they're actually saying beneath their words. You notice when your own defensiveness is rising. Before it takes over your response, you create space for genuine understanding rather than reactive argument. This quality of attention can't be faked or manufactured in the moment. It comes from consistent practice of bringing your scattered focus back to what is actually happening right now. What becomes clear as you develop these capabilities is that none of them function in isolation. Observation without memory is useless. Memory without attention is unreliable. Attention without presence is exhausting and unsustainable. The real power emerges when these mental disciplines integrate into a coherent system that operates with increasing ease as it becomes habitual. This is where intelligence training diverges most sharply from natural talent or occasional effort. An operative doesn't become skilled by trying really hard during important moments. They become skilled through unglamorous, repetitive practice that builds new defaults. They practice focused attention during mundane conversations until it becomes automatic. They practice active observation in low-stakes environments until noticing patterns requires no conscious effort. They practice emotional regulation when nothing important is at stake, so the capability is available when everything is. The The transformation isn't dramatic or sudden, it's the accumulated effect of small, consistent disciplines that gradually reshape how your mind engages with the world, until one day you realize you're operating with a clarity and capability that would have seemed impossible before you understood that excellence isn't about isolated techniques, but about the patient construction of better cognitive habits. The gap between understanding these techniques intellectually and having them actually improve your life comes down to a single unglamorous truth that most people don't want to hear. Intelligence work isn't built on brilliance or natural talent, it's built on relentless, boring consistency. The operatives who succeed in the field aren't the ones with the highest test scores or the most charisma. They're the ones who maintain their disciplines when tired, stressed, distracted, or discouraged. They're the ones who run through their mental checklist entering a new environment for the 10,000th time with the same diligence they brought to the first. They're the ones who practice emotional regulation during a pointless administrative meeting with the same seriousness they bring to a high-stakes operation, because they understand that excellence isn't something you turn on and off. It's a default state you construct through repetitive practice until the behavior becomes automatic. This is the part of intelligence work that never makes it into movies because it's not dramatic. There is no montage that can capture the significance of doing the same mental exercises every single day for months until your brain rewires itself. But this is where the actual transformation happens, and it's available to anyone willing to prioritize discipline over motivation. When you study how elite performers in any field actually operate, you discover that they do rely on tricks or techniques they pull out when needed. They rely on habits that have become so ingrained they no longer require conscious effort. A professional musician doesn't think about finger placement during a performance because they've practiced scales so many thousands of times that their hands know the patterns without conscious direction. A surgeon doesn't consciously think through the steps of a routine procedure because the muscle memory and decision trees are so deeply embedded that they can allocate their conscious attention to the unique variables of this particular patient. Intelligence operatives function the same way with their mental disciplines. When they walk into a room, the environmental scan happens automatically. When someone tells them something important, the memory encoding process engages without deliberate effort. When a situation becomes tense, their emotional regulation kicks in as a reflex rather than a conscious choice. This level of integration only comes from treating these practices not as special techniques you employ occasionally, but as daily disciplines you maintain regardless of whether they seem immediately relevant. The person who practices focused attention only during important meetings will never develop the capacity of someone who practices it during every interaction, even trivial ones. The person who tries to control their emotional responses only in high-stakes situations will fail, because you can't access a capability under pressure that you haven't built through consistent practice when the pressure is low. One of the most profound advantages that comes from this kind of consistent practice is the ability to maintain clarity and composure when everyone around you is losing theirs. In crisis situations, intelligence training reveals a stark truth. The person who stays calm isn't necessarily the smartest or most experienced. They're simply the one whose nervous system isn't hijacked by the stress response when chaos erupts, whether it's an actual emergency or just a work crisis, a relationship conflict, or an unexpected problem. Most people's cognitive capacity drops dramatically. The parts of their brain responsible for creative problem solving, nuanced judgment, and emotional intelligence essentially go offline as the amygdala takes over and initiates fight or flight responses. But someone who has consistently practiced emotional regulation and stress management maintains access to their full cognitive capability, even as their heart rate increases and adrenaline floods their system. This is an invisible advantage because from the outside, it just looks like they're naturally good under pressure. But it is not natural. It is the result of deliberately practicing calming techniques and emotional control during low-stress situations until those responses become automatic during high-stress ones. In practical terms, this means that when something goes wrong in your life, You rate the person who can actually think clearly and make good decisions, while others are still caught in the initial panic. That capability alone is worth more than any specific technique or tactic. The routines that support these capabilities don't need to be elaborate or time-consuming. They need to be sustainable and consistent. Intelligence services understand that asking people to maintain complex, demanding protocols leads to gradual degradation and eventual abandonment. Instead, they focus on simple practices that can be maintained indefinitely because they integrate naturally into existing routines. A 5-minute practice of focused attention each morning where you observe your environment without distraction. A habit of conducting a brief mental review each evening where you recall 3 specific observations from your day, strengthening both attention and memory. A practice of taking 3 slow, deliberate breaths before entering any meeting or important conversation, training your nervous system to settle rather than ramp up. These aren't dramatic interventions, but when maintained daily for months, they reshape your baseline cognitive functioning in ways that isolated effort never could. The key is removing the decision-making from the equation. You don't decide each day whether to practice. You simply have a set time and trigger that initiates the practice automatically. The operative who maintains their edge isn't the one with exceptional willpower. They're the one who built a system that doesn't rely on willpower at all. What emerges from this consistent practice is something more valuable than any individual skill. It has a fundamental shift in how you move through the world. You stop reacting unconsciously to whatever stimulus is most immediate and start responding deliberately from a place of clarity and choice. You notice things that give you advantage in negotiations, relationships, and decision-making that others simply miss because their attention is fragmented. You remember things that deepen your connections and enhance your credibility, while others struggle to recall basic details. You maintain your composure and effectiveness in situations where others become scattered and reactive. None of this makes you superhuman. It makes you consistently present and capable, while the people around you are operating at a fraction of their potential because they've never developed these foundational disciplines. The confidence this generates isn't the loud, performative kind that needs constant validation. It's the quiet assurance that comes from knowing you can trust your own perception, regulate your own responses, and maintain your effectiveness regardless of external circumstances. That internal stability is what intelligence professionals spend years developing, and it's what makes them effective in environments where instability is the only constant. The ethical dimension of these capabilities matters deeply because the same skills that makes someone an effective intelligence operative could be used for manipulation or exploitation. The difference is intention and constraint. When you develop these abilities with the genuine goal of improving your own clarity, effectiveness, and presence rather than controlling or deceiving others, they become tools for personal excellence rather than manipulation. The person who reads body language and emotional states to better understand and connect with people is developing empathy and social intelligence. The person who reads those same signals to exploit vulnerabilities is developing something dark. The techniques themselves are neutral. What matters is the framework of values and intentions within which you deploy them. Intelligence agencies spend significant time on ethics training, not because operatives are naturally unethical, but because powerful capabilities require clear moral boundaries. The same applies to you. As you develop greater ability to influence conversations, read situations, and maintain advantage through composure and awareness, you need equally clear boundaries about when and how you use those capabilities. The goal isn't to win every interaction or extract maximum value from every relationship. It is to operate with clarity, integrity, and effectiveness in service of outcomes that align with your actual values. The transformation these practices create isn't visible to others in obvious ways. You don't walk into a room projecting some mysterious aura or making declarations about your enhanced awareness. You simply become someone who notices things, remembers things, and maintains their clarity and composure with a consistency that others find subtly impressive but can't quite identify. Over time, People begin to seek your perspective in complex situations because you seem to cut through confusion to what actually matters. They trust your read on people and situations because you've demonstrated good judgment consistently. They value your presence in tense moments because you don't add to the chaos. None of this comes from techniques you consciously deployed, it comes from the person you've become, through consistent practice of fundamental disciplines. That's the ultimate insight from intelligence work. The most effective practitioners aren't the ones with the best tricks. They are the ones who've built the strongest foundation of basic capabilities, through patient, unglamorous repetition until excellence became their default, rather than their aspiration. In a world that's becoming increasingly noisy, fragmented, and reactive, the ability to maintain genuine presence, clear perception, and emotional regulation isn't just an advantage, it's becoming a rare and valuable form of power. The spy techniques that actually matter aren't about deception or secrecy. They are about developing a quality of attention and self-control that most people have abandoned in favor of constant distraction and reactive behavior. You now understand how these capabilities are built and why they work. The question is whether you'll treat this as interesting information you consumed, or whether you'll begin the consistent, disciplined practice that actually transforms understanding into capability. If this resonates with you, subscribe for more content that explores how intelligence principles translate into practical advantage in everyday life. Drop a comment sharing which of these habits you're committing to practice starting today. And if you know someone who values self-control, awareness, and the quiet confidence that comes from genuine competence, share this with them. The world doesn't need more people with tricks, it needs more people with discipline, presence, and the clarity to see what actually matters beneath the surface noise. You have everything you need to become that person. The only question is whether you'll do the work.